So we are recording now. Welcome for those of you coming in. Welcome, welcome. We are going to start in about a minute. So get comfortable. I know a lot of people are curled up in bed watching, which I think is the benefit of a virtual conference. Cool. So while you're waiting, I'm just going to introduce myself. I'm Dr. Breanna Boppre. Please just call me Brie. I'm also known as Brie Beaupre on the Twitter. And so I am an assistant professor of criminal justice at Wichita State. And I'm also a board member of CrimCon. So that is why I'm here hosting Stream 1 for the majority of today. And we're super excited to have you all here. This was an amazing turnout. We had over 300 presentation submissions. Some of our panels have had over 60 people in attendance, which is amazing. We've joked that it's more than what we have at ASC sometimes. So yeah, we're really happy with CrimCon. Welcome if you're just coming in. This is the first ever virtual conference hosted by CrimCon. So we're super excited to have you all here and to have so many great panels. So just a few things, I'll go over some instructions for panelists. So just a heads up, we're switching the order slightly in the program. I am a host, but I'm also a presenter. So to save time switching through slides, I'm going to present first. Each presenter will have 10 minutes. And then when you have questions, please type them in the Q&A box. And so we will answer those questions together at the end. And so this is what it should look like on your end as attendees. So again, use the Q&A box. And just remember to have fun. We started CrimCon to do something different, to do something fun and accessible and interactive. So we're super excited to have you all here. And with that, I'm going to start my presentation. So today I'm going to be presenting results from a Photovoice study with an alternative education program. And my co-authors are scholars from the School of Social Work in my same university, Wichita State. And so I think that Photovoice is not a typical method within criminal justice. I had never heard of it before working with my now close friend, Dr. Dasha Shamrova. And so I wanted to just take a moment to explain what Photovoice is and what the process is. And so Photovoice is a participatory action research approach. We're engaging those directly impacted through the research process to develop actionable policy recommendations. And so it empowers participants in decision-making. This is especially important for youth or children because it's a more child-friendly way of doing participatory action research. And basically it's using photos to tell a story. And so I'll show you what that looks like and how we build recommendations through this photo elicitation process. And so this particular study examined children's experiences in an alternative education program. And so this alternative education program was for youth who were suspended or long-term, they had expulsion or suspension from their regular schools, and they went to this alternative education program. And there's some unique things about this program. It's mixed level. So we had kids anywhere from 12 to 18 in that program, and that was represented in our participants. It was also very racially diverse compared to Kansas, which is 90% white. And so the way that it works is they're doing all of their coursework online on a laptop that's given to them that they work on while they're in the program in person. And so that's what it looked like pre-pandemic. I'm not exactly sure how things are looking now. But that's what it looked like when we did this project in spring 2019. And so really the goal of this program is to be a more inclusive having one-on-one mentorship, one-on-one counseling even with these kids, because many of them have behavioral issues that contribute to those academic issues as well. And so this is just an all-around more inclusive program for individuals who are expelled or suspended from their regular school. And so this was the majority of our sample. This was almost everyone who was in the project. I'm sharing this with you with consent from the participants. They consented to have these photos shared for a photo voice exhibit and social media. So that's why I'm able to share it with you. So these were our participants, again, very racially diverse compared to Kansas. And we had almost an equal split of boys and girls, and 11 students total participated in the program, or in our study. And so this is me, this is Dasha, my colleague, and this is Dr. Amy Kalb. So we were the researchers for this project. And so I'll talk a little bit about the photo voice process again, because it is so different from what we are used to in criminal justice research. So the first week of the process is on orientation. And so orientation lasts about 90 minutes. It includes talking about, what photo voice is, what the purpose of the project is. And my favorite part of orientation is teaching the participants effective photography skills. And so I took photography as an undergrad. So this photo voice research method really appealed to me because I love using creative methods in both teaching and research. And so it was a way for me to also have that outlet as well and help kids understand the photography process. And so weeks 2 to 4 are weekly focus groups. So we give kids a research question to answer, and they take photos to answer our research questions. And then each week we meet with them in what we call photo voice sessions to talk about their photos that they took. So they say, hi, my name is blank. I took this photo because, and they talk about why they took it and what it meant to them. And then we do a lot of probing, which I've found because kiddos do not want to say a lot at first. And so it does take a lot of probing, especially if they're younger. And so that lasts for 3 weeks. Then weeks 5 and 6 are analysis and prep for a community exhibit. And so the analysis part is where the PAR comes into this, because it's not us analyzing the data alone. We print out all the transcripts from those focus groups, and we build the narratives around their photos that they choose for the exhibit. And we do that together as a session. And so they're really helping with the analysis as well. And then the last part is the exhibit. So I'll show you what our community exhibit looked like. The 3 questions for this study that we asked the kids to answer each week were, what does an average day look like in the program? What do you like most about the program? And what did you like least, or what should we change? And so this is what the community exhibit looked like. We hosted it at Wichita State, which is my home university. And so we had the whole student union, this large room where we had over 50 community members come to see the exhibit. We also had the kids there, the participants, who could discuss their photos. We used pseudonyms chosen by the kids, so each photo and narrative could not be identified to the specific participant. And so after this, I'll share the full exhibit guide in the chat. I'll send you a link, but I just wanted to highlight a few photos and findings from it. There was a lot, like each photo and narrative is a full page. So I'm just giving you a really brief overview of it. And so they picked for the title of the exhibit an alternative path. And so they wanted to have this photo at the front, which is the doors of the program. And so we compiled these as composite narratives. So we put narratives from each participant woven together. So this is not just from one student or kid in the program. So they said, this photo means we can open new opportunities. You really have to start thinking about reaching your dreams. You need a diploma. That is what the program helps us do, to be prepared for adult things and new opportunities. And so that is the aim of the program, is to help them complete high school and move on. And so this is another photo of a desk with their laptop that they use for schoolwork. We sit in a classroom all day. It's boring. We can't stand up. We cannot talk when we work. Social-wise, I'd rather go back, meaning their previous school. But there were much more distractions. Work-wise, I'd rather stay here. So they mentioned they could get like a class done way quicker than in their regular school. Our previous schools were not perfect. Everyone at my school was really rude. And when I came here, everyone treated each other with respect. So we're seeing some pros and cons to the program, right? There's some benefits that they can get their work done quickly, but also they're lacking that social interaction that's typical in high schools. And they don't have a lot to worry about here, so they feel more safe and secure. And so this is my favorite photo. I really love this one. It's 2 photos combined, actually, so 2 participants. This picture describes someone's inner self. It reminds me that with a pen, you can't erase. If we're in a regular school, we would be expelled and we couldn't go back. This program helps us erase our mistakes and make corrections, just like a pencil. So I really like that because it symbolizes, what the program is really about, giving them second chances. And so this photo, again, was interesting to me as kind of like a critical lens against like surveillance and labeling. So I like this one. I felt like they stripped us of our freedoms. We're always under observation. There are cameras in front of us and behind us that monitors our every move. There's no privacy in this school. We feel like the rules are necessary, but they need to be adjusted. It's too strict for us. They need to give us incentives and rewards for our good behavior instead of so many restrictions. And so this is just them kind of, weighing through this process and giving their own recommendations for changes to make it better for other kids in the program. And part of that is the strictness of the rules, like things like they couldn't have their headphones, they had to sit in the desk all day, they couldn't walk around or talk to each other. Those were all some limitations. And so this is the last photo. We wanted to end the exhibit with another door. We all have problems. When we have stuff on our minds from home, stress or whatever, staff helps us talk through things. Then we can get back to work with a clear mind. Staff are available to us. You can really talk to them and they will listen. I'm a whole new person this year. I am more confident now. People see the difference. And so this is a real major difference with this alternative education program, again, is that they get that one-on-one counseling with individuals and there's less students to the teacher ratio. So they get more hands-on help and not even just with schoolwork, but also listening to their troubles at home or their behavioral issues. And so these were their final recommendations. I'm going to wrap this up really quickly. So expanding academic opportunities, so more sorts of classes and things offered to them, increasing social activities to be more like a regular school, and then improving disciplinary and incentive procedures. And so the biggest thing that I took away from this was giving youth a voice and choice in the research process. So I learned a ton just from working with my colleagues in social work. I can't say enough good things about having interdisciplinary collaborations. And I'm so glad I was able to learn from them about this research process. And these were 2 of the research participants who were speaking out about the project at our exhibit. And thank you so much for listening. I, again, am Brie Beaupre. Here's my Twitter handle and my email. I'll also send the full exhibit guide in the chat. So next we have Lauren.
All right, is everyone able to see that okay?
Yes, that's perfect.
Great. All right, well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lauren Morgan, and I am a doctoral student at the University of Missouri St. Louis. And my presentation today is titled Falling Between the Cracks, How the Organizational Processes of the Juvenile Court System Punish Crossover Youth. So the purpose of this research and why I really got interested in this line of research is because I was a case manager in the foster care system for 3 years. And during that time, I saw a lot of patterns with these kids who cross between both systems, that being the foster care and juvenile justice systems. And I can talk about that all day. But one of the main things and commonalities I saw was that a lot of these kids were struggling in their transition into adulthood. And so I wanted to come back and not only go back to grad school and study this further, but also right when I got my foot in the door, I wanted to start this exploratory qualitative research, interviewing practitioners from both sides of the system here in St. Louis. So ultimately, my research question became, do the organizational processes of the juvenile court system create unintended consequences that serve to punish crossover youth? And so a little bit of background on what crossover youth are. People use the term dual status, dually convicted, dually adjudicated youth, but crossover youth is really the broadest term we can use. And it's basically that the kid had a brush with each system. So that can look like a child who's in foster care, and then maybe they run away from a placement and have a run-in with the police, but were never formally adjudicated. That's a crossover youth. So estimating, as you can imagine, estimating the number of these youth is very difficult because the agencies don't talk. So we really don't have good numbers on this. And a little bit of background about the juvenile court system here in St. Louis. We have the overarching juvenile court that houses both family court and then juvenile justice. And under that, we have Division of Youth Services, which handles out delinquency matters, and then Children's Division, which handles out foster care, case management. That's where you have your social workers and that kind of thing. But the main takeaway is that they're both separate. And so to pull in a theoretical framework, in my paper, I talk about org theory and punishment theory a lot, but for the purpose of today, I'm just going to focus on the organizational theory. And basically in org theory, we assume that organizations are tightly coupled and uniform. And basically in 1989, John Hagen said that American criminal justice system is not tightly coupled, not uniform, and actually it's loosely coupled. And where the subsystems of the American criminal justice have this separateness in their identities. And so what happens because of that is we have slower reactions, a violation of rules, little coordination, and then randomness in outcomes. And I think what my data shows is that the juvenile court system here in St. Louis is also a loosely coupled system. So for my methods, I conducted 12 semi-structured interviews in depth, and my sample criteria was pretty simple. You basically had to work on either side of the system here in St. Louis and had to have experience working with crossover youth. And so I worked primarily with one gatekeeper who I met through volunteering at a local foster care organization here in St. Louis. And he knew a lot of great contacts from me. We kind of sat down and talked about the goals of my project. And then each person he kind of referred me to also referred me to other people. So, you know, I say mix of propositive and snowball sampling. Most of my interviews were on Zoom, but they started in person. And then, of course, the pandemic hit. So here is a table of my participants. So as you can see, most of the people I interviewed were from practitioners from the foster care side. These were case managers, licensed social workers, and then I also had 2 juvenile officers and 1 juvenile court judge who worked on both sides. So as someone who's worked with this population, it was very important to be reflexive throughout the entire process. And I did this by taking a lot of time on my protocol and really changing my protocol as the project transpired. And my project really did change. I started with the goal of wanting to know more about crossover youth and trying to get perspectives from the practitioners. And I kind of realized that the practitioners are much better able to talk about themselves than the kids. So my protocol definitely shifted to this more organizational systems approach. And you know, using my protocol, I kind of incorporated more things about tell me how you interact with the other system, that kind of thing. So it definitely changed as the project transpired. And I engaged in line-by-line coding, sticking very closely to grounded theory. And I kind of came up with, what I did was I kind of came up with a model that I'll get to in the next slide. And then my last interviews were kind of used to saturate out the model that I saw, this overarching model that I saw going on, and then also the sub-themes. So this is what I believe is really going on in my data. So overarchingly, you have the juvenile justice and foster care systems who don't talk. And if you know a little bit about juvenile justice, you know about the deinstitutionalization of juvenile detention facilities. And so, you know, for example, when I went to the juvenile detention center here in St. Louis, there were only 6 kids in that facility at the time, which is great. And this is pre-COVID, where there used to be up to 100 kids in this facility. So that's great. But what's happening is a lot of these kids are kind of infiltrating into this child welfare system without the infrastructure to handle it. We also see a lot of pressures from with changes in state requirements impacting the child welfare system, COVID-19, a lot of different things that's really burdensome on caseworkers and social workers. And then also a lack of consistency in outcomes, which ultimately ill serves the children. So I think this quote kind of gets at my overarching model. I for the sake of time, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but just highlighted in red, this case manager, she said, and we're begging delinquency to get involved, right? And they won't. And she's just talking about a child who has behavioral issues. And basically the takeaway here is that this kid isn't going to find the proper placement and isn't going to get the services he or she needs. And this is a common theme that I saw. And then getting into one of my sub-themes, increased strain on the child welfare system, I'm going to read to you just this quote, a short quote from my gatekeeper. And he said, I think that over the years, there used to be 3 distinct systems: juvenile justice, mental health, and child welfare, and they've all melted together. Everything moves into the child welfare system without funding us to do it. And then a little bit more on this increased strain on the child welfare system. This participant, she also was on the case management foster care side, and this quote to me kind of just dehumanizes the children altogether. She talks about the pressures from the state and the processes that take place, kind of a lot of input coming into the system and not so much ability for output. And she kind of says at the end here, we don't want to keep them forever, them being foster kids. As soon as we get a child into permanency, we get a new case. So as you can see, it really dehumanizes the child, in my opinion. And then jumping to the unintended consequences for crossover youth. So one was improper placements, and multiple people talked about this, but this was a tragic story that the chief juvenile officer of St. Louis County talked about. And it was a child who was in the juvenile detention facility, was about to be released. And because child welfare didn't want to take him back, he almost got placed in an adult homeless center. And she says, but you can't put a youth like that in an adult homeless center. It's just improper. It's such a failure of the system, and it truly is. And then the commingling of delinquent and foster youth in residential facilities. So this is an issue that the juvenile court judge talked about. And he said, we try not to lock them up with delinquent kids, them being foster kids. Sometimes they get locked up with delinquent kids because we don't have any foster care parents. And so I'm just going to kind of wrap up with that. I could go on and on. This is very rich data, lots to explore, but obviously a limitation is that I need more practitioners from the juvenile justice side. In the future, I would like to explore more about these organizations from, these institutions are very racialized and gendered, so exploring those elements of the organizations as well, and then exploring how COVID-19 is impacting everything. So thank you.
Great. I think those are very important future directions for sure. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to be presenting a project, or at least like a semi-project from my dissertation titled Representing Juvenile Lifers, Do Attorneys Matter in Parole Board Hearings. I also want to state that I was trained as an attorney, and so that's kind of where my research, that's why I'm particularly interested in legal representation in the parole process. So I actually want to start with Henry Montgomery, which those of you who are involved in juvenile justice research are probably familiar with this decision. This was a Supreme Court decision that came down in 2016. And Henry Montgomery was sentenced in 1963 to an automatic sentence of life without parole for killing a police officer. He initially had received the death sentence, but that was annulled. And so he was convicted again and then received a life without parole sentence. Before his decision in 2012, the Supreme Court had banned automatic life without parole sentences. And so what Henry Montgomery was asking was that that decision should apply to individuals like him who were already serving life without parole sentences. And the Supreme Court agreed. But what they didn't do is sort of clarify what a meaningful opportunity would be for individuals like Henry Montgomery to show that they have changed and that they should be released into the community. And so this is kind of the operative word in the decision with may, giving states the options to decide between resentencing and parole board hearings. And I am specifically interested in parole board hearings because of the amount of discretion that is involved in their decision making. So Henry Montgomery has had 2 parole board hearings so far. He has been denied parole on both counts. He is now actually 74 years old, and he will come up for his next parole board hearing, I believe, at the end of 2021 or early 2022. One of the reasons that I wanted to examine legal representation is also because of the variation in the extent to which attorneys are actually allowed in parole board hearings. So as you can see on this map, Louisiana, where Henry Montgomery is, he does have the right to counsel, as along with some of these other states like California, Montana, Nebraska, Minnesota, Kentucky, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Delaware, and then New Hampshire. And then in most other states, there is no automatic right to counsel in parole board hearings, despite what you might see in TV shows and in movies. And not even for juvenile lifer candidates like Henry Montgomery and others like him. And so I was interested to see in one state what it was like to have legal representation and whether that impacted parole outcomes. In terms of prior research that's been out there, most research has focused on factors related to case files of individuals and whether these factors impact the decision to grant or deny parole. So type of offense has received a lot of attention. Where more serious the offense, the less likely you are to be released on parole. Rehabilitative efforts in terms of whether the parole candidate participated in rehabilitative programming in prison. That also seems to matter, along with their disciplinary history. So the number of tickets they might have received during their time being incarcerated, as well as any move to a higher custody setting because of a serious disciplinary infraction, or if they've picked up new crimes. Community support and opposition to release also matter. Community support in terms of how many friends and family members actually show up to the hearing to support the candidate. And opposition, both in terms of victim impact statements from victims' representatives, as well as prosecutorial and law enforcement objections, can also impact the decision to grant or deny parole to someone. What hasn't necessarily been examined is whether having an attorney present is related to whether someone is being granted or denied parole. That is not to say that there has not been any research out there. There has been, but it has been fairly limited, in part because of the variation in terms of who is eligible to get an attorney during the parole board hearing. I do want to give a little bit of a shout out to Kristen Bell, who is an assistant professor of law at the University of Oregon, whose own research has kind of shaped a little bit of what I do. Her research has examined parole board hearings of juvenile lifer candidates in California. She hasn't extensively analyzed legal representation, but it is one of the main variables that she has looked into. And other legal scholars like her have also supported the need to have legal representation in parole board hearings, particularly for juvenile lifer candidates, because they went in as young adolescents. They have often been incarcerated for decades together, and they're not in a position to put up a legal defense. Even though a parole board hearing is not a criminal court proceeding, it still has a lot of adversarial elements, and it is also highly discretionary. So in terms of analysis, what I wanted to look at is whether having representation was associated with higher odds of release on parole. And if so, if there was variation by type of attorney. So if you had representation through a public defender or a private attorney empaneled by a public defender agency, are you more likely to be granted release on parole? And I also wanted to look at the impact of legal representation on lowering the odds of getting a higher interval term, which is the amount of time that someone has to wait before they can come up for their next hearing. And in the state that I examined, it's between 1 and 5 years. So I wanted to see if having representation reduced the odds of getting a maximum interval term, which is 5 years, and whether, again, that varied by type of attorney representation. So in the state that I examined, I was able to get written decisions between 2005 and 2018 for juvenile lifer candidates. I had 207, and they represented about 105 juvenile lifers. And because they have multiple appearances within this time period, I was able to control for them using, we're able to control for the clustering effect by controlling for people who have appeared more than once in the same study period. In terms of some simple distributions, as you can see in this, juvenile lifers without representation, of course, did not fare. There were more denials of parole, but there were also more denials of parole even if they were represented. And the frequency is not, the differences in frequencies is really not too much. And when I did a chi-square test, it was not statistically significant. The distribution of denial decisions with interval terms was a little bit different. And again, these are all denial decisions because that is when you get an interval term, which is the amount of time you have to wait for the next hearing after you've been denied parole. So those without representation had more maximum interval terms, whereas those who had representation had more 1 to 4 year terms, so lesser interval terms than the 5-year maximum. I was able to conduct a few logistic regressions. So instead of showing your table, I thought a graph would be a better way to show it. So this is a coefficient plot for the logit model. The red line that you see here on the 0 on the x-axis represents the null hypothesis. And as you can see, attorney representation does not seem to be associated with the granting of parole. But what is associated is the rehabilitation index. So meaning if someone had a higher score on the amount of rehabilitative efforts they have taken, they were nearly 3 times more likely to be granted parole. Similarly, the more number of supporters that they had, more likely to be granted parole, but only at the 95% confidence interval. And then if they had multiple appearances, they were less likely to be granted parole. In terms of type of attorney, again, type of attorney was not associated with granting of parole, but the same 3 factors were, including with type of attorney variables. And then in terms of interval terms, again, attorney presence was not associated, but the same, well, 2 of the same. So rehabilitation index, if you had a higher score on the rehabilitation index, you were nearly 53% less likely to get a maximum interval term. And then if you had supporters at a hearing, you were also less likely to get a maximum interval term. And then opposers was also significant with interval terms, as well as a return to higher custody, as well as having more life offenses. And what's significant with type of attorney, though, is that appointed attorneys, so if you basically had a public defender or a private attorney who is impaneled by the public defender agency, then you were less likely to receive a maximum interval term. And if you had a retained attorney, so someone that you hired privately, or you had a student attorney, you were more likely to receive a maximum interval term. So what this is really showing is that representation by appointed attorneys lowered odds of interval terms, meaning that training of appointed attorneys seem to matter, that they probably have more opportunities to help with juvenile lifer candidates because they are trained because they're particularly trained to help these clients, or they might also be selection effects. Who is actually getting an appointed attorney versus who is actually getting a retained attorney? And I'm happy to take questions about that because I know I'm running out of time as to how these attorneys are appointed. And so this is to say that it's not that attorneys don't matter in the parole process, it's that they matter in ways that go beyond securing the grant of parole. And so instead of limitations, I have a few future directions here, but I think I am running out of time. Or almost good. Okay, so instead of doing study limitations, which I don't particularly like doing this, don't particularly like presenting study limitations because as we know, every study has its limitations. I wanted to sort of reorient it as future directions. So one, of course, is doing interviews with attorneys, which I have completed, but also with their clients. I also want to examine racialized differences and how that might operate in decisions to grant or deny parole. And then also looking into variation by place, particularly because parole board hearings operate so differently across the country. So I know I'm out of time officially, even on my slides, so I'd be happy to take any questions at the end for any clarifications. Thank you.
Well, bonus points for all the gifts. I loved it. Great. Now we have our next panelist.
Hello, everybody. For those of us who haven't met before, my name is Alida Merlo, and I want to talk with you about trauma-informed education for delinquent youth in residential placement. Before I begin, I would like to thank the whole Criminology Consortium Board for organizing this. Brie's part of that. Thank you very much. It's a great honor to be able to participate. Quickly, I want to give you an overview of what I'd like to talk with you about today. And that is, I want to talk briefly about the research on trauma-informed care, how it's being implemented in juvenile justice, what specifically Pennsylvania legislation talking about trauma-informed education in 2019 might mean, juveniles in residential placement and where I would like to conduct the study, the survey plan, and some future directions. So let me begin by talking about adverse childhood experiences, which many of us are familiar with. That is to say, the research was conducted in the 1990s by Kaiser Permanente and the CDC. And in that research, they found out that as many as 60% of the participants had childhood experiences that involved at least one adverse experience, which we call ACEs, that's the acronym, of course, and about 20% reported 3 or more of those experiences. What is an adverse childhood experience? There are a number of behaviors that constitute, or a number of actions that constitute this kind of act. It can be emotional abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse. It can be neglect. It can be drug abusive patterns in the house. It can be mental health issues. It can be an incarcerated family member. The consequences of those adverse childhood experiences persist into adulthood. In fact, there's research that suggests the brain is even affected at critical stages of development, and those children end up being at greater risk for delinquent and criminal behavior. Fast forward to 2010, when Eric Holder was the Attorney General of the United States, and he, in fact, instituted the Defending Childhood Initiative, which was designed to address the effects of childhood violence and also try to prevent it and intervene with respect to treatment. Before Eric Holder got involved, though, Kathy Spatz-Whittem was doing research in this area in the 1980s, the 1990s, and into the 21st century, and then subsequently with Maxfield as well. And she found that victimized children had an increased likelihood for delinquency and criminality and violence. And she also found out that they would subsequently have difficulties with education, occupation, and mental health. One of the critical pieces of literature besides Kathy Spatz-Whittem that influenced Eric Holder was the work of David Finkelhor and his colleagues that was conducted in 2009, the NATSEV survey, which dealt with children's exposure, National Survey on Children's Exposure to Violence. And what David Finkelhor and his colleagues found out was about 60% of children and youth had experienced at least one exposure to violence, crime, or abuse, and as many as 40% were the direct victims of 2 or more acts. Again, youth exposed to violence either as victims or as witnesses were also at greater risk of engaging in criminal behavior or delinquent behavior and violence. In 2015, Finkelhor and his colleagues went back and did another round, and they reiterated their earlier findings. They were substantiated. These youth were more likely, those who had been exposed to victimization and trauma, more likely to be involved in the child welfare and the juvenile justice system. What about trauma-informed practices? What is it all about? Well, research suggests that trauma-informed practices can address the consequences of the victimization that children and youth have experienced, and they can also intervene to break the cycle of violence and the cycle of hurt that has occurred consequently. It is not, I don't think, coincidental that our move toward trauma-informed practices occurred in the latter part of the 90s into the 2000s, because we also began to move away from a very punitive juvenile justice system that characterized the 1980s and the 1990s. So it was fitting that trauma-informed care, the idea of prevention, the idea of treatment, would take hold. So what about trauma and the juvenile justice system? Depending on the research that you look at, it's pretty clear that there is a pattern, that is to say, youth in the juvenile justice system tend to have been exposed to various types of violence and traumatic events before they were justice system involved. How extensive? It depends on whose research you look at. Some estimated at 75% of the youth who are in the system, as high as 90%. It is the chronic nature of the maltreatment that can predict subsequent involvement in the juvenile justice system. And we would be remiss if we didn't say the system can sometimes inflict trauma as well. And that one area that I'm interested in is out-of-home placement, removing a child from his or her home, and at the same time, any trauma that that child can experience while he or she is in custody. How has the juvenile justice system stepped up to the plate? Well, very clearly, we have instituted trauma-informed care practice in many aspects of juvenile justice. For example, keep picking up on what Lauren was referring to, the crossover youth model. We have the crossover youth practice model, which has been introduced, and it involves agencies actually collaborating, working together, child welfare agencies and juvenile court personnel, entering into memorandums of understanding, sharing resources, identifying youth problems, and working together to resolve them. We also know that law enforcement has been involved. The Child Development Community Policing Program in New Haven, Connecticut, a program in North Carolina, the International Association of Chiefs of Police, all working together with mental health workers to try to serve that particular population. The National Child Traumatic Stress Network actually established a bench card for the trauma-informed juvenile court judge. So judges have research, they have references they can rely on, they have guidance when they're dealing with juveniles. And clearly, Durkheesing and Marsh have talked about juvenile probation and detention and how that has played out. But I'm really interested in education, and I want to talk with you about what we've known so far about trauma-informed care or trauma-informed approach that might carry over into education. First of all, we know that it's important to screen youth who come into the juvenile justice system to see if they have experienced trauma. It's important to provide a structured and safe environment. It's also worthwhile to look at the attitude of the staff members that are involved, and also the organizational culture, how that is in fact interacting, or how they are in fact participating and viewing trauma. And it changes our focus. When you think about the juvenile court judge and the bench card, the juvenile court judge is asking this question: what has happened to this particular youth, as opposed to what's wrong with this particular youth? What happened before this juvenile came into the system? And then we have the sanctuary model, which has been very popular in dealing with trauma, first introduced by Bloom and Streethar. And the sanctuary model has this acronym SELF, referring to the 4 elements of it: safety, emotions, loss, and future. So these are the kind of strategies that we've used thus far in dealing with trauma. But let's fast forward to trauma-informed education, because that's the newer issue on the horizon right now. A number of states have enacted trauma-informed education legislation. And in fact, the federal government referred to trauma-informed education when they re-upped the National Juvenile Justice Act in 2018. But very simply, what I'm interested in what's going on in Pennsylvania. And our governor, Tom Wolf, signed legislation in 2019, which was called Senate Bill 144, which established trauma-informed education in public and private schools and provided funding for it. What does the literature tell us about trauma-informed education? It tells us that we can improve classroom instruction and student interactions in the classroom. There is some discussion by Walke and Cox about trauma-sensitive teaching. There is certainly a lot of research on agency commitment, the agency being committed to the idea, and the use of evidence-based research or evidence-based approach. What do we know about juveniles in custody in residential facilities in the United States? According to Puzinchera et al. And their recent data book on juvenile facility residential census, we know that there are about 1,500 facilities, actually 1,510 for youth in the United States that are residential. And there are 5 states with the largest number of facilities. And as you can see on this list, California is number 1 with 104, and Pennsylvania is number 2 with 94. So that's why I'm particularly interested in looking at Pennsylvania. How about largest juvenile residential populations? Clearly, California is in the lead with over 4,000 youth currently in residential placement when the survey was done. And you see Pennsylvania was number 3 with 2,300 youth in residential placement of various sorts. This study I'm proposing to do is going to be a survey of all facility administrators in Pennsylvania. There are 94 facilities, so there's going to be 94 people contacted to participate in the survey. Pennsylvania is unique because 72 of that 94 are privately operated, privately run facilities. That's not the pattern nationally, but that's the pattern in Pennsylvania, that it's overwhelmingly privately run. I want to explore the educational programs and the extent of trauma-informed care and education 1 year after the legislation. I hope that the findings will help fill the research gap regarding teachers' roles in addressing and treating trauma, and also creating a trauma-informed educational milieu. After I get the quantitative data, I also want to go out and interview, probably by Zoom, given COVID-19, the teachers and administrators, educational administrators at those programs. So here are the research questions. How is trauma-informed care and education defined? Does trauma-informed education occur in the Pennsylvania juvenile residential facilities in line with the law? Is there formal training? Who participates in the training? How is that program implemented, delivered, and evaluated? What do I hope to do with that research? I hope to be able to share those findings with program directors and teachers. I hope to be able to help inform policy a small bit because we don't have a whole lot of policy regarding trauma-informed education. I hope that there are successful strategies that programs and institutions can emulate. And I just want to stress at the end that the consequences for children are considerable. Those are my references, and thank you very much.
Great, those were excellent presentations. So now I'm going to open it up for Q&A, and we have one, which is for me. Hello, did you face any challenges with participant buy-in to do the Photovoice project? So with that one, with the alternative education program, we held the Photovoice sessions and orientation while they were at the program. So that was easy. So instead of doing like their regular recreation, which was, art or something like that, they did the Photovoice sessions instead. So we targeted it as like a creative outlet that they could do instead of their other recreational activities. And so it did not take away time from their education and their academic work. Rather, it was a creative outlet for them to do. So no, all the kids who were in the program at the time participated. There was only one kid who signed up and then did not complete the project. So it was good. I will say I'm doing a new Photovoice project now with youth in community supervision. And that has been a challenge because the correctional agency will not let us hold the Photovoice groups at the same time they go to the center for their groups. And so that has definitely been a challenge. So I think it depends on the community partner and what they allow you to do. And also right now during a pandemic, that is a little complicated too. A question for Dr. Stuti. Stuti is her first name. You mentioned that racial differences may also affect the decision on parole ease. Is there some work being done to create a racial balance among the judges during juvenile parole hearings?
Not that I'm totally aware of. So one of the ways, I guess, is to examine racial disparities is what we usually do, which is to take the racial identity of the candidates and then see if their racial identity is impacting the decision to grant or deny parole. And so that would be the first step to see that. In terms of the racial composition of the board itself, from the state that I examined, it is mostly white. So I do think that does sort of play out, but I think more than quantitatively, that might be something to examine qualitatively, which is what I plan to do in the summer. So I do have parole board recordings. I'm going to be working with a rhetoric scholar. So using some of the more humanities approach to understanding how candidates present themselves and then how parole board members interpret their presentations and seeing if there are any racialized differences emerging from that.
That sounds awesome. I have a question for Alida. So in the gender responsive corrections world, which is what I work with correctional agencies, there's an evaluation template to assess whether an agency is following gender responsive principles. Is there anything like that for trauma informed generally for education or in detention settings or any of that? Like, is there a model like for evaluators to assess whether a program or organization is following trauma informed principles?
Yes, the National Child Traumatic Center has a bunch of instruments that they use to try to gauge what the organizational climate is and whether or not there is support for trauma-informed education. And they may even have some that deal specifically with trauma. So if you go to that website, Brie, they have lots of information, and you will see that they can give you. They have PowerPoints you can go through and all kinds of information about the services that they offer too.
Awesome. Could you repeat it one more time? Sorry.
I believe it's the National Child Traumatic Center. I'm getting it wrong, I know.
That's okay. I can find it from, those words.
I believe it's the National Child Trauma Center.
National Child Trauma Center. Cool. Thank you. Any other questions? We have like 3 minutes if anybody has questions. I will say I've really enjoyed this panel. It was great hearing about everyone else's research. Cool. What was the most surprising piece of information from each of your studies? I'm going to let the other panelists go first.
I can go, I guess. So for me, I kind of talked about this, but just how my project transpired, I really wanted to learn more about the kids and what was going on with them, like case studies, that kind of thing. And I couldn't believe how different the practitioners from the foster care kind of that social work background reacted to my questions and answer the questions compared to the juvenile justice side. Much more open to talk, much more willing to talk. I don't want to say more friendly, but much more open to giving me information, and that was pretty surprising to me. So just like the differences in the practitioners was really interesting to me.
I haven't conducted my study yet, and I'm getting ready to. And I can tell you that I don't know what I'm going to find, but I'm very interested in this field because I think that, especially for youth in residential placement, historically, they don't have the advocates that other children and youth do. And it's really imperative that we pay attention to what's happening with respect to trauma-informed education there. Thanks.
I think the surprising thing with the quantitative results is that having representation didn't necessarily impact granting or denying parole. And I think, and this is especially for graduate students who go in hoping to get that result that kind of supports what you think you're going to find and then not finding it. That was a bit of a surprise to me, but I think what's even more surprising, and I guess also a good thing, is that attorneys help reduce those interval terms, so the time that someone has to wait before they can go up for their next hearing. And that's not something that's received a lot of attention in research, and that's where there is a lot of discretion for the parole board. They can go anywhere from 1 year, 5 years, and in states like California, they can even impose a 10-year interval term. So there is a lot of discretion involved, and the fact that attorneys are able to help reduce that is very meaningful because it can give hope to people who are coming up for parole board hearings. So if you say, hey, come back in 1 year, that's more meaningful to some people because they think, oh, I just have to do a little bit more to get ready and then I'm going to be out. So that to me was really surprising, but also extremely meaningful.
I think for me, the most surprising part of my study was just one, how involved Photovoice is. I will not lie, it is a ton of work, especially like developing the narratives and putting the exhibit together. But also what surprised me was how rewarding it was to work with kids. I've never worked with kids in my research before. And honestly, it was one of the most meaningful studies I've ever done for me personally. And the exhibit, when the children spoke out about what the research process meant to them, I was crying. So like, yeah, it had a huge impact on me. And now like, I'm all about Photovoice. I'm doing a Photovoice project right now. I want to do another Photovoice project with children of incarcerated parents. That's next on my list. And so, yeah, I'm super excited about the future to build participatory action research into criminal justice because it typically has not been done in our field as often as social work or other fields. So with that, if there aren't any more questions, I'm going to wrap up the panel. So thank you all so much for coming. This was amazing. I loved hearing all your presentations. You each did an excellent job. And so if anybody wants to stay for the next session, you'll have to sign out and sign back in because I'm going to stop this webinar. And so just feel free to sign back in. And again, thank you all for coming. This was awesome. And I hope you have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And I'll send you that link for the Child Traumatic Stress Network.
Yes, please. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, everybody. Bye.
Bye, Stuti.
Bye. See you.
Yep.
Hi.
Oh, hi. How are you? I'm closing out this session just to give you a heads up.
Oh, okay.